I used to think rain made people feel safer. When you're inside with the windows shut and the sound of water drowns out everything else, it almost feels like the rest of the world disappears. I believed that until one stormy Friday night 2 years ago. Now, every time I hear heavy rain hitting my roof, I find myself checking every lock in my house without even thinking about it. The strange part is that nothing about that night seemed unusual at first. If anything, it felt like the kind of evening everyone has at least once a year. It was early November, and I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the warehouse where I worked outside Indianapolis. By the time I clocked out, the rain had already started. The weather app warned about flash flooding and strong winds, but I figured I'd be home in 40 minutes if traffic wasn't too bad. My wife was visiting her parents for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. I stopped at a gas station, grabbed a frozen pizza and a soda, then headed home through the back roads I usually took to avoid the interstate. About 20 minutes into the drive, visibility became terrible. The rain was coming down so hard that even with my wipers on full speed, I could barely see 50 feet ahead. That's when I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people were driving home from work. The vehicle stayed a few car lengths back for nearly 10 minutes. Every time I slowed down because of standing water, it slowed too. Every turn I made, it followed. I remember telling myself I was being paranoid. There was only one road leading toward town. Of course, another driver would be going the same way. Then I turned onto a narrow county road that almost nobody used after dark. The headlights turned with me. I glanced in the mirror again. It looked like an older, dark pickup truck. I couldn't make out the license plate because the rain blurred everything together. Another mile passed. The truck stayed behind me. I started paying attention to little things. Whenever I tapped my brakes, the truck immediately matched my speed. It never tried to pass me even when the road opened up. It never backed off either. When I finally reached my neighborhood, I felt relieved. That relief lasted about 5 seconds. The truck turned into the neighborhood too. I told myself maybe the driver lived there. It wasn't impossible. I made another turn. So did the truck. I drove past my own street instead of turning into it. I wanted to see what happened. The truck kept following. At that point, my heart started pounding. Instead of going home, I circled the neighborhood twice. Every turn I made, the truck copied it exactly. I couldn't convince myself it was a coincidence anymore. I pulled into the parking lot of a closed elementary school, thinking maybe the truck would finally drive away. Instead, it stopped at the opposite end of the lot. Neither of us moved. Rain hammered against my windshield so loudly that it sounded like someone dumping buckets of gravel onto my car. I couldn't see the driver. The truck's headlights stayed on. After about 30 seconds, I backed out and left. The truck followed again. Rather than driving home, I called 911 through my car's Bluetooth. The dispatcher answered immediately. I explained everything while trying to sound calmer than I actually felt. She asked for my location and told me to keep driving toward the nearest police station instead of going home. The closest station was about 15 minutes away. I never made it there. Halfway into town, the truck suddenly turned off onto another road without warning. Just like that, it disappeared. I actually laughed from relief. I felt stupid for overreacting. Maybe the driver really had been going the same direction after all. I went home. Looking back, that's the biggest mistake I made. The rain had eased up a little by then. I pulled into my driveway around 9:30. Everything looked normal. I unlocked the front door, tossed my keys on the kitchen counter, started preheating the oven, and changed into sweatpants. About 20 minutes later, while waiting for the pizza, I heard something outside. A metallic clink. It sounded like someone touching the backyard gate. I looked through the kitchen window. Nothing. The motion light wasn't on. I figured the wind had blown something over. Then my dog started growling. He almost never barked, but this growl was different. Low. Continuous. He was staring toward the sliding glass door. I walked over and looked outside again. Still nothing except rain dripping from the fence. I closed the blinds anyway. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my driveway camera. Motion detected. I opened the live feed. The screen showed heavy rain and an empty driveway. No person, no vehicle, just static from the weather. I assumed the storm had triggered it. Then another notification appeared. Backyard motion detected. When I switched cameras, the image froze for a second before loading. Someone was standing at the very edge of the yard, too far away for facial details, just a dark silhouette beside the fence. Before I could zoom in, the figure stepped behind my shed. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the laundry room and called 911 again. The dispatcher told me officers were already on the way. I locked myself in the bedroom while keeping the camera feed open. For nearly 4 minutes, nothing happened. Then, the backyard camera suddenly went black. Not disconnected, just black. Almost immediately after that, I heard 3 slow knocks on the sliding glass door downstairs. Not loud, just enough to let me know someone was there. My dog went absolutely crazy. I remember standing frozen in the bedroom doorway, holding the flashlight even though I knew it wouldn't help. Another 3 knocks. Then, silence. The police arrived less than 5 minutes later. They searched the property but found nobody. One officer noticed muddy footprints leading from the backyard fence toward the woods behind my house. They followed them for a while before losing them in the rain. They assumed whoever had been there took off when they saw the patrol cars. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The following afternoon, one of the officers called me back. He asked if I'd driven through the old Miller Road construction area the previous night. I said yes. He told me another driver had reported a dark pickup truck parked there for nearly 2 hours with no lights on. Apparently, someone had been watching traffic. He couldn't say whether it was connected to my report, but the description matched. Over the next month, little things started happening. Twice I found muddy footprints near the side gate after heavy rain. Once my mailbox was left hanging open, even though the mail had already been delivered. Another time my driveway camera recorded a vehicle slowly driving past my house just after midnight. It was too dark to identify. No license plate, just headlights. Eventually, everything stopped. At least I thought it had. Almost a year later, I was cleaning out old files on my phone when I decided to download the original security footage instead of streaming it. The downloaded video was much clearer. When I paused the frame where the figure stood near the fence, I noticed something I'd completely missed before. The person wasn't looking toward my house. They were looking directly at the backyard camera, almost like they knew exactly where it was. Even stranger, they were holding something long in one hand. At first, I assumed it was an umbrella. After zooming in, I realized it wasn't. It looked like a pry bar, the same kind firefighters use to force open doors. I brought the footage to the detective handling property crimes. He agreed it looked suspicious, but said there wasn't enough evidence to identify anyone. The case went nowhere. About 6 months after that, another detective contacted me unexpectedly. He asked if I still had the video. Police in another county had arrested a man connected to several home invasions during severe storms. His method was simple. He followed people home late at night, waited until they relaxed inside, then checked doors and windows while the rain covered any noise. Most victims never saw him until he was already inside. The detective never confirmed it was the same man from my footage. Legally, he couldn't, but he did tell me something I haven't forgotten. During questioning, the suspect admitted he preferred rainy nights because people almost never looked outside more than once. Now, whenever storms roll through, I don't just lock my doors. I check the cameras, leave every exterior light on, and make sure someone always knows where I am. Maybe the truck behind me that night really belonged to the man they arrested. Maybe it didn't. Either way, every time heavy rain starts pounding against my windows, I remember those slow knocks on the glass and the dark figure standing perfectly still beyond the fence, waiting for me to believe I was finally safe. Most people assume the scariest part of a storm is the lightning. That's what I used to think. A loud crack of thunder might make you jump, but at least you know what caused it. What happened to me 3 years ago changed that. Now, whenever a storm rolls in after dark, I find myself listening for sounds that don't belong, sounds that can't be explained by wind or rain. At the time, I was 29 years old and working as a maintenance technician for an apartment complex outside Columbus, Ohio. It was late April, and a line of severe thunderstorms had been moving through the area all afternoon. By the time my shift ended, weather alerts were going off on everyone's phones. The local news warned people to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, I still had a 40-minute drive home. The rain started the moment I pulled out of the parking lot. Within 10 minutes, it became one of the worst storms I'd ever driven through. Water covered parts of the road, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the wind kept shoving my truck toward the shoulder. I considered pulling over somewhere, but most businesses along the route had already closed because of the weather. About halfway home, I noticed flashing hazard lights ahead. A small SUV was parked on the side of the road. A woman stood beside it, waving her arms. I slowed down. Looking back, I know most people would tell me that stopping was a bad idea. Maybe they're right. The woman looked to be in her 30s. She was soaked from head to toe and clearly panicked. "My phone's dead," she shouted through my cracked window. "Can you call someone for me?" I handed her my phone. She stepped back toward her SUV while talking to someone. I couldn't hear the conversation over the rain. A few minutes later, she returned and thanked me. "My brother's coming," she said. "He lives nearby." I nodded and drove away. The whole interaction seemed normal. I didn't think about it again until nearly an hour later. By then I was home. I lived alone in a small rental house, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was about 200 yards away. Normally, I liked the privacy. That night it felt different. The storm kept getting worse. Wind rattled the windows. Tree branches scraped against the siding. Power flickered twice before finally going out completely. The house went dark. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and lit a few candles. Without television or internet, there wasn't much to do except wait for the storm to pass. Around 10:30, I heard knocking. 3 quick knocks on the front door. At first, I thought I imagined it. The wind was loud enough to create all kinds of strange noises. Then, it happened again. 3 knocks. Definitely the door. I checked the peephole. Nobody. I opened the door anyway. Rain poured down from the roof. The yard was empty. No cars, no people, nothing. I locked the door and went back inside. 5 minutes later, the knocking returned. This time it came from the side of the house, not the front door. A window. I froze. Tap, tap, tap. Slow and deliberate. The flashlight suddenly felt very small in my hand. I walked toward the living room window and carefully pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Only darkness and rain. I was starting to convince myself that tree branches were hitting the glass when my phone buzzed. A text message. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. The message contained only 3 words. "Thank you again." It took me a second to understand. The woman from the roadside. She must have gotten my number from the phone I lent her. I typed back. "No problem. Hope you got home safe." Several minutes passed. No response. Then another text appeared. "Are you alone?" I stared at the screen. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Maybe she was making conversation. Maybe not. I didn't answer. A minute later, another message arrived. Someone followed me. That got my attention immediately. I called the number. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. Then another text. "I think he's outside." My heart started racing. If she was in trouble, I couldn't just ignore it. I asked for her address. No reply. Instead, another message appeared. "He knows where you live." I remember reading that sentence 3 times. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank. My second thought was much worse. The lights outside suddenly came back on as power returned. At the exact same moment, motion lights illuminated my backyard. Something had triggered them. I rushed to the kitchen window. A figure was standing near the tree line, just standing there, watching the house. The distance made it impossible to identify whether it was a man or woman. Before I could react, the figure stepped back into the darkness, gone. I called 911. While speaking to dispatch, I locked every door and window in the house. An officer was sent to investigate. Estimated arrival time, 20 minutes. That felt like forever. I stayed in the living room with the flashlight and a baseball bat. Rain hammered against the roof. The woods behind the house swayed violently in the wind. Every shadow looked like a person. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Then I received another text. "Don't let him in," I immediately replied. "Who is this?" No answer. Instead, a photograph arrived. My stomach dropped. The picture showed my house, not an old photo, a current photo, taken from somewhere outside during the storm. I ran to the nearest window and looked out. Nothing. The yard appeared empty, but someone had clearly been there. Someone close enough to photograph the front porch. The dispatcher stayed on the line while officers headed my way. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A door handle turning, slowly. The back door. I could hear the metal rattling. Someone was trying to get inside. I moved toward the hallway and listened. The handle turned again. Then again, a louder shake this time. The person knew the door was locked. For several seconds, everything went silent. Then came 3 heavy bangs, not knocking, shoulder impacts. The entire doorframe shook. I backed away. Another impact, then another. I honestly thought the door would give out. Suddenly it stopped. Complete silence. Even the storm seemed quieter. Then headlights appeared through the front windows. A police cruiser. The moment it pulled into the driveway, the motion lights behind the house activated again. An officer later told me they caught sight of someone running into the woods. They searched for nearly an hour but found nobody. No footprints either. The rain had washed everything away. I showed them the text messages. That changed everything. Investigators traced the number. The results made no sense. The phone belonged to the woman I'd helped earlier, but according to her brother, she'd never sent any messages. In fact, she didn't even have her phone. She'd left it inside her disabled SUV before getting a ride home. Police recovered the vehicle the next morning. The phone was gone. At first, they assumed someone had stolen it. What they discovered a week later was far worse. A man with a lengthy criminal record had been hiding near the roadway during the storm. Investigators believe he watched me stop to help the woman. When she stepped away with my phone, he likely memorized my number from the screen. Later, after stealing her abandoned phone, he began sending messages to both of us. The theory explained most of the situation. Most. What it didn't explain was why he chose my house, until detectives searched his vehicle. Inside they found photographs, dozens of them, pictures of isolated homes, rural properties, people living alone. My house was among them. The photograph had been taken almost 6 months before the storm. Long before I ever met the woman, long before I stopped to help her. According to investigators, the suspect would drive through rural areas identifying houses that looked easy to target. He never admitted what his intentions were. He eventually accepted a plea deal for multiple unrelated crimes and was sent to prison. As far as I know, he's still there. But every now and then, when storms knock out the power and rain pounds against the windows, I think about that night. I think about the photograph taken months before I ever knew anyone was watching. And I think about how close I came to opening the door one more time after hearing those knocks. Because if the police had arrived even 5 minutes later, I don't know if I'd be here telling this story. I still remember the exact sound that made me realize something was wrong. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was the slow, deliberate splash of footsteps outside my bedroom window. This happened in September of 2023 when I was 26 and renting a small cabin about 30 minutes outside Asheville, North Carolina. I had rented it for a week because I worked remotely and wanted a quiet place to finish a project. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by thick woods. The owner told me the nearest occupied house was almost a mile away. That sounded relaxing when I booked it. By my 3rd night there, it didn't feel relaxing anymore. It had been raining since early afternoon, and by sunset, the storm had turned into one of those relentless downpours where everything outside disappears behind a wall of water. Around 8 o'clock, I cooked pasta, watched a baseball game until the internet cut out, and decided to head to bed early. Just before 10, I noticed my phone had no signal either. I figured the weather was affecting the nearby cell tower. The cabin suddenly felt much more isolated than it had a few hours earlier. I locked every door, checked every window, and turned off the lights. Sometime after midnight, I woke up because Murphy, the owner's old Labrador that stayed at the property to keep wildlife away, was quietly whining in the hallway. He wasn't barking. He just stood perfectly still facing the front of the cabin with his ears raised. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward him. The living room was dark except for occasional flashes of lightning through the windows. The dog refused to move. He kept staring at the front door. I listened carefully. At first I heard nothing except rain pounding against the roof. Then came 3 slow knocks. They weren't loud. Whoever knocked wasn't trying to be heard by the neighbors because there weren't any neighbors. It sounded more like they already knew I was awake. I stayed silent. Another 3 knocks followed about 30 seconds later. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. Lightning flashed again, briefly lighting the yard. Still nothing. I told myself someone might have been caught in the storm and stepped off the porch to avoid the rain while waiting. Against my better judgment, I called out through the door. "Can I help you?" No answer. Just rain. I decided not to open it. Instead, I walked to the kitchen where I could see part of the driveway through a side window. That's when I noticed a pickup truck parked just beyond the edge of the property with its headlights off. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. It sat completely still beneath a group of pine trees, barely visible through the rain. I watched it for almost a minute. Nobody got out. Nobody moved. Then my flashlight flickered and died. The batteries had been weak since I arrived. I replaced them, but by the time the light came back on, the truck was gone. I convinced myself it had quietly driven away while I was changing the batteries. Still, I dragged the couch closer to the front door without really knowing why. Around 1 in the morning, the power went out. The entire cabin fell silent, except for the storm. My phone still showed no service. I lit 2 candles and sat in the living room, telling myself I'd laugh about this in the morning. Then, I heard footsteps on the wooden porch. They moved slowly from one end to the other, stopping beneath each window as if someone was looking inside. Murphy growled so deeply I almost didn't recognize it as coming from him. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room window. I carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to look. A man stood less than 10 feet away wearing a dark rain jacket with the hood pulled low over his face. He wasn't trying to hide. He was staring straight into the cabin. Before I could react, lightning lit up the yard, and he smiled. Not a normal smile. Just enough for me to see his teeth before everything went dark again. I dropped the curtain immediately and backed away. My first instinct was to call 911, but my phone still had no signal. I searched the cabin until I found an old landline mounted beside the refrigerator. Dead. Either the storm had taken it out or it had been disconnected years earlier. The footsteps resumed, circling the cabin. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of someone testing the back door. The handle moved gently once, then twice. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. They seemed patient, almost curious. Murphy suddenly barked and charged toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I followed just in time to hear another noise, a window sliding open, not breaking, opening. One of the bedroom windows had apparently been left unlocked by a previous guest. I slammed the bedroom door shut, shoved the dresser against it, and listened. The cabin became quiet again. Too quiet. Nearly 5 minutes passed without a sound. I wondered if the man had left. Then I heard water dripping onto the hardwood floor. Not from outside, from inside the hallway. Someone had climbed through the bedroom window and was standing somewhere beyond the blocked door. Slow, wet footsteps crossed the hallway, then stopped directly outside my room. Murphy stood between me and the door, barking non-stop. The doorknob turned once, then stopped. I could hear breathing on the other side, heavy, calm, like the person was simply waiting. Suddenly, bright headlights swept across the bedroom walls. A vehicle had pulled into the driveway. I heard a truck engine followed immediately by a car horn blasting several times. Whoever stood outside the bedroom door ran. I heard boots pounding through the hallway, then the sound of the bedroom window slamming shut. By the time I moved the dresser, the cabin was empty. I looked outside and saw an older man standing beside a pickup truck with a flashlight. It was the property owner. He had driven over after noticing the security cameras at the entrance had gone offline during the storm. Together we searched the cabin while he called the sheriff using a radio he kept in his truck because cell service in the area was unreliable. Deputies arrived about 20 minutes later. They found muddy footprints leading from the open bedroom window into the woods, but no suspect. One deputy asked whether anything had been stolen. Nothing was missing. Another deputy inspected the bedroom window and noticed something strange. The screen hadn't been forced. It had been carefully removed and leaned against the wall without making much noise. Whoever entered had done it before. Before I left the next morning, the property owner apologized repeatedly. He admitted another guest had reported hearing someone outside the cabin during a storm almost 6 months earlier, but deputies had never found evidence of a break-in, so he assumed it had been wildlife or someone passing through. 2 weeks later, he called me again. The sheriff's office had arrested a drifter living in an abandoned hunting shack about 3 miles from the cabin. Inside they found binoculars, maps of nearby vacation rentals, canned food, and a notebook filled with dates and descriptions of occupied cabins. According to investigators, he watched rental properties for days before approaching them during heavy storms when the sound of rain covered his movements and poor weather delayed emergency response. The sheriff couldn't prove he was the same man who entered my cabin, but after hearing that, I never needed proof. Every time a storm rolls in now, I remember the image of that man smiling through the rain, standing perfectly still outside the window as if he already knew there was nowhere I could go.